His inheritance was a curse, a ruined ranch and an old horse that was the ultimate symbol of failure. Little did he know that despised animal was the only key to $1 million fortune hidden right under his feet. If stories about the power of inheritance resonate with you, subscribe to the channel to continue this journey together. The night in the Chihuahuan Desert was a cold canvas of indifferent stars, and under it, Itzàl Romero worked with the silent fury of a man who had found God and the devil in the same place. The trembling light of his lantern danced on the dark water of a hidden spring, pulling silvery glints from the stones at the bottom. His hands, already calloused from ranch work, were now wounded, bleeding against the sharp gravel as he dug. Each fragment of ore he pulled from the icy mud felt too heavy, not because of its physical weight, but because of the weight of the secret it carried. Beside him, the old horse, whose grey coat seemed to absorb the darkness, stood as still as a statue of dust and bones, but its ears swiveled, catching sounds that Itzàl's ears, dulled by desperation, could not discern. And then the sound came, a dry snap, not of an animal, but of a boot stepping on a branch. Itzàl froze, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He raised his eyes to the crest of the canyon that surrounded them, and he saw silhouettes. 2, maybe 3, cut out against the starry sky. They weren't rurales. Their postures were too relaxed, predatory. They were the human vultures of the desert, drawn by the faint light of his hope. The same horse that had led him there let out a low snort, a warning that vibrated in the air. In that instant, Itzàl understood the true nature of his inheritance. The silver was not salvation. It was a beacon that painted him as a target for all the desperate and cruel men who roamed those unforgiving lands. With a swift movement, he extinguished the lantern's flame, plunging himself and his secret into the protective darkness. The darkness was total, a thick substance that muffled sound and sight. Itzàl remained crouched in the icy water, his entire body a knot of tension. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the snap of the branch, a vacuum filled only by the ragged beat of his own heart. Then voices floated down from above, distorted by the wind. "Did you see that?" a hoarse voice asked. "A light, down there near the water." The sound of loose stones rolling down the slope indicated they were starting to descend. Itzàl's hand, trembling, found the horse's rough flank. The animal remained motionless, a pillar of calm in its owner's storm of fear, exhaling a warmth that was the only real thing in that nightmare. To stay there was a death sentence. The moon, even in its waning quarter, would eventually betray his position. With a slow, deliberate movement that screamed against every instinct to flee, Itzàl pulled himself from the spring. Water streamed from his clothes in silent rivulets. He grabbed the small leather pouch where he had stored the first pieces of ore, the tangible proof of his fortune and his doom. With one hand on the horse's tangled mane, he surrendered to the animal's wisdom. The horse, with an intelligence that transcended that of a simple beast, seemed to understand. Hoof by hoof, avoiding the stones that could give them away, the animal began to move, guiding Itzàl away from the spring towards the deeper shadows of the canyon, where the darkness was an ally and every step was a gamble against the dawn. The echo of the men's voices reached Itzàl like the whispers of ghosts, fragmented and distorted by the canyon walls. He couldn't make out the words, only the tone, a mixture of greed and frustration. He and the horse moved as one shadow along a goat trail that bordered on the impossible, a path no man would have chosen in the dark. Below, a new light flickered. A lantern, stronger than his, swept across the spring. Itzàl paused behind a sandstone pillar, risking a glance. The light caught the stirred water, the disturbed mud. He could feel their curse even from a distance, the anger of arriving too late. Then the light stopped, focusing on something on the ground, a track, not his but a hoofprint perfectly impressed in the soft mud. One of the men shouted something, the word echoing clearly. Romero! They knew. Their knowledge was a blow colder than the stream water. This was not a random hunt. It was personal. They knew his family, his inheritance, his failure. They had probably been watching him for days, waiting for the old grandfather's legend to prove true. The horse, sensing the stiffness in his body, took a step forward, pulling him away from the precipice and into a shallow alcove, a recess in the rock carved by centuries of wind. It was a precarious shelter, but it hid them from the view below. There, in temporary safety, Itzàl's fear began to transform into something harder, sharper. The horse nudged his hand with its muzzle and then pushed at the leather pouch on his belt. The weight of the oar was a reminder. This was no longer about luck or a miracle. It was about survival. The ranch was compromised. Going back there would be a trap. His grandfather's true legacy was not the map to the silver, but the knowledge of the land. A knowledge he had passed not to his grandson, but to the one creature he could trust to keep it. And now, that creature was telling him that the only way was forward, into the heart of the desert, where men like them dared not follow. The horse didn't wait for a command. With a push of its flank, it urged Itzàl to move. Below, the beam of the men's lantern swept the canyon floor like the eye of a restless cyclops, passing just feet from where they had hidden. Guided by the animal's silent wisdom, Itzàl followed it away from the alcove, even deeper into the darkness. The path became steeper, ending abruptly, against a rock wall that seemed impenetrable. For a moment, panic threatened to suffocate Itzàl's newfound determination. A trap. But the horse did not hesitate. It pushed its muzzle against a dense tangle of ocotillo and thorny shrubs growing at the base of the wall. Hesitantly, Itzàl pushed aside the barbed branches, scratching his already wounded hands, and revealed what they hid. A dark fissure, a narrow crack in the stone, little wider than a man's shoulders, exhaling a cold, ancient air. Entering the crack was an act of blind faith. The darkness inside was absolute, an absence of light so profound it seemed to have weight and texture. Itzàl kept one hand firmly clasped on the horse's mane, the animal serving as his only anchor to reality. The sound of the voices and the shifting stones outside disappeared, replaced by the muffled echo of the horse's hooves on the rocky ground and the ragged sound of his own breathing. The air smelled of damp earth and ozone, the scent of places that had not seen the sun in centuries. He understood then. This was not just any natural cave. It was a passage, a secret vein through the mountain, a path his grandfather must have known or even created. As they moved slowly through the belly of the earth, Itzàl felt a wave of admiration for the old man he had judged so harshly. The ruined ranch was a facade, a distraction. The real wealth and the real escape route had always been hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right guide to reveal. What a powerful moment when the true genius of an ancestor is finally revealed. If you were also moved by this discovery, show your support with a like and subscribe to continue with us through this dark passage towards the unknown. The passage was a long, winding path through the navel of the mountain. Time lost all meaning. It could have been minutes or hours. Itzàl walked in a trance, guided by the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves. The sound was his only map, a metronome in the absolute silence. With his free hand, he brushed against the cave wall, feeling the cold, damp rock, the texture of centuries of secrecy. His mind, free from immediate panic, began to piece things together. The stories his grandfather told, dismissed as the ramblings of an old man, now revealed themselves as coded instructions. The abandoned ranch, the lack of fences, the horse that roamed free, they were not signs of neglect, but part of a system. The horse was not just a pet, it was a guardian, the living map that could not be stolen, burned, or deciphered by strangers. Then, a change. The air, once still and heavy, began to move, bringing with it the smell of dry dust and night-blooming creosote, a phantom breath in the stone tomb. The horse stopped and raised its head. Itzàl felt the change in the animal's posture, a subtle alert. Ahead, the darkness was no longer total. It was diluted, a grey smudge against the deep black. They moved forward a few more feet, and the crack opened to the sky. It was not the starry sky from which they had come. It was the pre-dawn sky, a ghostly grey light that outlined a different world. They had crossed the spine of the ridge. They were on the other side. Below them, the vast expanse of the desert unfolded, and far in the distance, almost at the edge of sight, Itzàl saw a tiny needle of fire, the campfire of the men hunting him, now reduced to an impotent insignificance by the distance and the mountain. A biting wind swept the ridge, bringing with it the pre-dawn desert chill and causing Itzàl's wet clothes to cling to his skin like a canvas shroud. The relief he had felt at seeing the distant campfire was ephemeral, replaced by the overwhelming vastness of what lay ahead. He was alone, on the wrong side of a mountain, without food, without water, and being hunted. He looked at the small pouch on his belt. The silver ore seemed to have lost its shine, its promise now silenced by the primary need for survival. It was then that the horse snorted, a cloud of white vapor in the half-light, and nudged his shoulder with its muzzle. It was not a search for affection. It was an order, a reminder that the mountain had offered an escape, but the desert below would demand a tribute. Without waiting for a response, the animal began to descend, not down the open slope, but via a series of steep, rocky switchbacks that were almost invisible in the faint light. Every step the horse took was calculated, its hooves finding purchase where Itzàl saw only loose gravel. Itzàl followed, his hands and feet finding the same holds, his body protesting with exhaustion, but his mind focused on a single truth. He was not following an animal. He was following a survival map that had been passed down through generations. As the first crimson thread of light painted the eastern horizon, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the desert floor, they descended, no longer fleeing, but moving towards a purpose that only the horse knew, leaving behind the silver, the hunters, and the life Itzàl Romero once thought was his. The sun rose, transforming the biting cold into an oppressive heat with frightening speed. The desert floor was a furnace, and Itzàl's clothes dried on his body, leaving a stiff crust of salt and minerals. His thirst became a physical presence, a file in his throat. Every instinct screamed for water, for rest, but the horse moved with an unwavering rhythm. It was not a panicked flight, but a measured pace, conserving energy under the brutal sun. Itzàl realized the horse was not just moving away from danger, but towards something. Its path was not random. It followed invisible lines across the landscape, navigating through treacherous patches of cholla cactus and across plains of cracked earth with a certainty that defied logic. It was a pilgrimage, and Itzàl was merely the acolyte. When Itzàl felt his legs would give out and his vision began to swim in the heat mirage, the horse stopped. They were in a seemingly ordinary basin of sand and rock, indistinguishable from the miles they had already crossed. The horse then pawed at the ground, a few firm scrapes with its forehoof at the base of a withered mesquite tree, whose roots clung desperately to the baked earth. Itzàl watched, bewildered, and then dropped to his knees, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. He dug with his raw hands where the horse had indicated. The sand was looser there, and a few inches down, it became damp, then miraculously cool. He dug deeper, his heart pounding to a new rhythm of hope, until his fingers broke through into a small pocket of muddy but vital water. It was a hidden tinaja, a secret cistern known only to the oldest inhabitants of the desert. The horse nickered softly, a sound of quiet confirmation, and lowered its head to wait its turn. The water was earthy, tasting of minerals and time. But to Itzàl, it was the sweetest nectar he had ever tasted. He drank slowly, cupping it in his hands, feeling the coolness extinguish the fire in his throat and spread through his exhausted body. Only when his own desperate thirst was slaked did he move aside, gesturing for the horse. As he watched the animal lower its powerful neck, its long muzzle dipping into the small pool, a wave of emotion hit him, shame for his past contempt, gratitude so profound it ached. He finally remembered the name his grandfather used for the horse, a name Itzàl had always found. Ridiculous, sombre, shadow. Now, under the unforgiving sun, the name made perfect sense. The horse was not just a shadow, it was the shadow of his grandfather's foresight, a silent protector that moved unseen through the world. The relief, however, was temporary. The sun climbed higher, a white, merciless eye in the sky, and the heat became a physical weight. Sombra did not linger by the water. After drinking his fill, he nudged Itzàl again, this time with less urgency and more of a firm insistence. He led him across a flat of hot stones that seemed to float in the shimmering air toward a formation of dark rocks that rose like an island in a sea of light. Itzàl followed without question, trust replacing fear. The destination was a shallow overhang, a mouth in the rock that offered a deep and cooler shade. It was not a cave, just a recess, but it was enough. As they settled into the gloom, escaping the direct gaze of their pursuer in the sky, Itzàl understood another lesson. The desert offered sanctuary as well as peril, but only to those who knew where to look. In the forced stillness of that rock shelter, time stretched and grew sticky like the heat. While Sombra stood in an almost meditative quiet, Itzàl was haunted by his thoughts. His grandfather's madness, which he had so despised, was in fact a lucid and complex sanity. The ruined ranch was not a failed inheritance, it was a disguise. The old man hadn't left him a curse, but a test he had been failing until the true legacy, the horse, took the reins. With trembling hands, Itzàl opened the leather pouch and spilled the ore into his palm. In a sliver of sunlight that pierced the shade, the raw silver glinted, not with the promise of wealth, but with the cold gleam of allure. Every gram was a weight that dragged him down, a shout in the silence that drew the wolves. As the shadows began to lengthen and the sun bled into shades of orange and purple on the horizon, the desert exhaled a collective sigh, releasing the heat of the day. Sombra stirred, shaking the dust from his coat with a shudder that ran the length of his body. It was a signal, as clear as a spoken command. Itzàl looked at the ore in his hand one last time before pouring it back into the pouch with a decisive gesture. He would not throw it away, not yet. It was his burden, the proof of his mistake, and perhaps his only bargaining chip in an uncertain future. He rose, his muscles protesting, and placed a hand on the horse's neck. The animal rested its head against his chest for a brief moment, a gesture of complicity that transcended species. Then, together, they stepped out from the safety of the rock into the growing twilight, moving not as master and animal, but as two survivors bound by the secret knowledge of the land. The night brought a new kind of clarity. The oppressive heat gave way to a crisp, sharp air that honed the senses. Under a canopy of stars brighter than Itzàl had ever seen, they moved across a gravel plain that resonated softly under Sombra's hooves. The steady rhythm was hypnotic, and Itzàl found himself watching, learning. He noticed how the horse tested the ground before committing its full weight, how its ears constantly swiveled, mapping the sound world of the night. For the first time, Itzàl didn't feel the desert as an enemy, but as a vast, indifferent entity with its own rules and secret pathways. He was no longer running from something. He was being led, somewhere, following a map etched not on paper, but in the memory and instinct of his only companion. Hours later, when the moon had already traced a pale arc across the sky, Sombra veered from the open plain toward a low, dark rock formation, a silhouette against the stars. He stopped with an abrupt finality before a wall of rock that seemed perfectly solid, but the horse lowered its head and nudged with its muzzle at a cluster of dry, thorny bushes growing at the base. Intrigued, Itzàl pushed the branches aside, his hands protesting with new scratches. Behind the curtain of vegetation was a low opening, the entrance to a small cave or shelter sealed by a large, flat stone that had clearly been fitted there by human hands. With his heart now pounding a rhythm of anticipation instead of fear, Itzàl used all his strength to dislodge the stone, revealing a darkness that smelled of dust and time. Inside, the air was stale and still. Using the faint light from the entrance, Itzàl found what he was looking for: a small oil lamp, and beside it a tin container sealed with wax. With trembling fingers, he broke the seal and found matches, dry and perfectly preserved. The flame wavered before steadying, casting a golden, dancing light that pushed the shadows into the corners. What the light revealed made Itzàl fall to his knees. It was not treasure, but something infinitely more valuable. A wooden crate held packages of jerky and dried figs. There were 2 full leather canteens, the water cool and untainted by stagnation, and a folded woolen blanket. It was a survival cache, an oasis of provision left by a prescient ghost. Outside, Sombra waited patiently, a dark sentinel under the stars. Beside the food crate was a small leather-bound chest. Itzàl opened it with a reverence he had never felt for his grandfather in life. Inside there was no silver or gold, but a hand-bound journal and a crudely drawn map on deerskin. The first page of the journal bore the old man's scratchy handwriting. "If you are reading this, then Sombra has kept his promise, and you have proven worthy of hearing it." With his heart in his throat, Itzàl read. The journal told the true story of the family. The silver was not a blessing, but a fever that had attracted betrayal and death. The ranch was a tombstone, a reminder of what greed could do. The men hunting him were descendants of the same traitors, and the horse, Sombra, was the guardian of the only legacy that mattered, the knowledge to live freely in this unforgiving land. The map showed not veins of silver, but other cisterns and shelters like this one, a web of safety woven into the heart of the desert. The words on the page were a weight heavier than any silver. Each line was a ghost that rewrote Itzàl's history, transforming his grandfather from a senile failure into a tragic strategist, a man who had spent his entire life preparing an escape, not for himself, but for his bloodline. Itzàl looked at the small leather pouch at his belt, the fever, the bait, the same curse that had poisoned his ancestors and now ran in his veins. Outside, in the stillness of the night, he could hear the soft, rhythmic breathing of Sombra. The sound was not that of an animal, but of a promise kept across the years, the heartbeat of a living legacy. He finally understood. The ruined ranch was the family's scar. The network of shelters was the cure, with a resolve that seemed to come not from himself, but from the blood of his ancestors. Itzàl made a decision. He would no longer be the prey. He would become a ghost, just as his grandfather intended. He took the canteens of water, the jerky, and the blanket, the true wealth of this place. The journal and map were carefully tucked into his shirt close to his heart. Then he picked up the pouch with the silver ore. For a moment he hesitated, feeling the seductive pull of its weight. With a sharp movement, he emptied it onto the dark floor of the cave. The stones fell with a dull thud, the sound of a treasure being buried for a second time. Free of the weight, feeling lighter than he had in years, he left the cave and sealed it again with the stone. Outside, Sombra raised his head, and in the horse's dark, intelligent gaze, Itzàl saw not a servant, but a partner. He was no longer lost. He had a map, a guide, and a purpose. For the first time in this long ordeal, Itzàl mounted Sombra. It was not an act of a master, but of communion. The horse accepted his weight without hesitation, and when they moved, it was as a single creature born of the desert night. The map in his shirt was a warm secret against his skin, but the true compass was beneath him, the steady rhythm of hooves beating out a new cadence for his life. They moved east, not toward a town or a road, but deeper into the thorny embrace of the desert, following the spiderweb of refuges his grandfather had woven. Each step was no longer an escape, but a pilgrimage, an act of claiming the inheritance he finally understood. Meanwhile, the campfire Itzàl had seen from the mountain ridge was not of men who had given up. The oldest of them, a man with a face like a cracked leather map named Cien, was a tracker whose bloodline knew this land as well as the Romeros. He had seen the silver in the hands of Itzàl's father and his father's father before that. At dawn, he found what he was looking for at the base of the canyon, the disturbed vegetation, the fresh scratches on the rock. Where Itzàl had revealed the fissure, he ran a finger over the marks, the only sign of emotion a narrowing of his eyes. The hunt was not over, it had merely changed the board. Romero and his ghost horse had vanished into the mountain, but the mountain had another side. And the desert, Cien knew, does not keep secrets forever from those who know what questions to ask. The days dissolved into a primordial routine of sun and stars. They traveled mostly in the cool of the night and early dawn, with Itzàl using the deerskin map to plot a general course, while Sombra interpreted it, finding the invisible paths through the terrain. During the brutal heat of the day, they found shelter as instructed in the journal, under the belly of a shale outcrop, or nestled in a ravine where the shade lingered. Itzàl learned to read the land through his grandfather's words and Sombra's instincts. He learned that a certain type of vegetation indicated underground water, that the flight of buzzards could betray the location of a carcass, and thus predators to be avoided. The phantom weight of the silver on his belt had been replaced by the real weight of knowledge in his mind. He was no longer an heir. He was becoming part of the legacy. Meanwhile, Cien and his 2 men had lost the trail, but not their determination. To the other 2, the chase seemed futile, a hunt for a spectre in an ocean of sand. But Cien operated on a different logic, one passed down through his own lineage of predators. His grandfather wasn't crazy, he said one night as the fire crackled, his eyes fixed on the darkness. He was a desert fox. He wouldn't teach his grandson how to find silver, he'd teach him how to disappear. Cien wasn't looking for tracks, which the wind would erase in minutes. He was looking for water. He knew from old stories in his own family of the existence of a network of secret cisterns. He didn't know where they all were, but he knew the location of one. It was a gamble, a guess, based on legends. But in the desert, legends and survival were often the same thing. He was leading his men not on Itzàl's trail, but toward an inevitable point of convergence. A week later, the landscape changed from rock and gravel to low, petrified dunes, waves of sand solidified by time. Itzàl no longer needed to consult the map every hour. He was beginning to feel its flow, to see the hidden logic in the paths his grandfather had charted. One night as he rode, he felt a subtle change in Sombra's gait, an almost imperceptible rhythm of anticipation. He pulled out the journal and in the moonlight found the corresponding entry. "The well of the solitary eye," his grandfather had written. "The water here is deep and cold, but the basin is a trap. It can be seen from a great distance and offers little cover. Fill your canteens and leave before the sun finds you." The message was clear. The next refuge was a vital resupply point, but also the most exposed in the network. They approached the well of the solitary eye with the first grey of dawn, moving through the shadows of a low ridge. The place was a natural depression, a circular scar on the desert floor with a single eye of dark water at its center. Sombra stopped before they entered the basin, his body tense as a bowstring. His nostrils flared, and he let out a low, almost inaudible snort. Itzàl felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning cold. Following the horse's gaze, he saw it. Near the water's edge, almost invisible against the dark sand, were the fresh tracks of hooves. But that wasn't what made his blood run cold. Beside the marks of a horse, there was the distinct, unmistakable track of vehicle tires. The desert fox and his ghost horse were not the only ones converging on this oasis. The modern wolves had arrived first. Retreat was an instinct deeper than fear, an inherited wisdom that flowed through Itzàl. There was no panic. With an imperceptible pressure of his knees, he communicated with Sombra, and the horse responded, moving backward step by step, its hooves making no more sound on the sand than the shadow the rising sun was beginning to cast. Every meter they moved away from the well seemed to increase the pressure in the air, the feeling of being watched from an unseen sight. His grandfather's warning echoed in his mind, not as a prophecy, but as a fact. The basin was a trap, the water was the bait, and the vehicle tracks were the open jaws, an arrogant announcement that the hunters now controlled the hunting ground. They knew Itzàl would need water and were simply waiting. Hidden behind the protecting ridge, Itzàl dismounted and crept to the edge, using a crack in the rock as a peephole. The morning sun now illuminated the scene, and he saw them. Almost a kilometer away, camouflaged against an outcrop of rust-colored rock, was an old jeep. Beside it, a figure watched the basin with binoculars. Cien. Itzàl didn't need to see his face to know. The patience of the posture, like that of a vulture waiting for life to leave its prey, was unmistakable. A wave of cold washed over Itzàl, followed by a sharp clarity. The map, his guide and salvation, had become his noose. Cien wasn't following his tracks, he was reading his mind, or rather his grandfather's mind. To go to the next shelter would be to march directly into an ambush. He looked at Sombra, who was not looking at the jeep, but south, toward an expanse of seemingly impassable desert, a maze of dry ravines and rocky mesas. In that instant, Itzàl made a new decision. His grandfather had given him a map to survive, but Cien also had a map. It was time to draw a new one. Thirst was a coal in his throat, and the sight of water less than a kilometer away was physical torture. His canteens were dangerously light. For a paralyzing moment, he wavered, primal need warring with reason. But then he looked at the still figure of Cien, and then at the steady gaze of Sombra, who was still staring south. The choice was between certain death and a chance at life. With a slow, deliberate nod, an acceptance of his new reality, Itzàl put the map away. His grandfather's knowledge was no longer a path to follow, but a guide to what to avoid. He mounted the horse, the movement fluid and without hesitation, and together they turned their backs on the well. They did not retreat the way they came, but plunged directly into the labyrinth of ravines to the south, a territory his grandfather's map had simply marked as broken land. For the first time, they were truly off the map. From his vantage point, Cien waited. The sun climbed, baking the rocks, and the impatience of his men was an irritating buzz. He ignored them. He knew thirst. He knew it was a matter of time before the Romero boy made a mistake, drawn in by the promise of water. But the hours passed, and the basin remained empty. Then a flicker of movement where there should be none. He raised his binoculars, scanning not the approach to the well, but the ridge to the south, and there they were, a lone silhouette of man and horse moving deliberately into the heart of the broken land. Cien lowered the binoculars, a glimmer of something resembling respect in his hard eyes. The boy wasn't running into a trap. He was choosing a different hell, one Cien didn't control. "He's not coming," Cien said quietly, more to himself than to the others. "The cult has learned to think like the old fox." The broken Land lived up to its name. It was a labyrinth of narrow canyons and steep ravines, where the rock walls closed in on themselves, creating shadows that deceived the eye and an unstable floor of gravel and shale. Itzàl's thirst went from being a nuisance to a living creature inside him, clawing at his throat and fogging his mind. Yet Sombra moved with a certainty that defied the chaotic landscape. The horse didn't follow a path, it created one, its hooves finding purchase in places that seemed impossible, its body navigating the crevices with a fluidity that spoke of ancient knowledge. Itzàl surrendered himself completely to its lead, his body swaying in unison with the horse's, his mind focused only on enduring, on matching the animal's unwavering resistance. His grandfather's words now echoed with a new meaning. The land provides, but only for those who know how to listen. Back at the well, the frustration of Cien's men was palpable. "Let's leave him," one of them said, wiping sweat from his face. "He'll die in there. No one survives the broken land without water." Cien spat on the ground, a gesture of contempt for their lack of vision. "He won't die," he said, his voice low and rough like the stones around him. His grandfather prepared him for this. That land is not his grave, it's his fortress. He turned to his men, his eyes like chips of obsidian. "Get the packs and the canteens. The jeep stays." The protest died on the other man's lips at Cien's glare. The old Tracker knew that technology was now useless. The hunt had become what it was always meant to be, a duel of endurance, knowledge, and will, man against man, in a land that forgave no mistakes from either of them. The sun turned into a merciless hammer. Itzàl's throat was a miniature desert, and his mind began to play tricks on him, seeing the glint of water on rocks he knew had been dry for centuries. He clung to Sombra's mane, no longer as a rider, but as a drowning man clings to wreckage. It was then that the horse stopped. Its stop was not one of exhaustion, but of intention. It turned its head and pushed Itzàl with a force that almost knocked him from the saddle, directing him toward a cluster of rocks where a solitary, swollen biznaga, a barrel cactus, grew. With the last vestiges of clarity, Itzàl understood. He slid to the ground, pulled out his knife, and hacked off the top of the cactus. The fibrous, moist pulp inside was not water, but it was life. He ate a handful, the bitter moisture soothing the fire in his throat, and then offered pieces in his palm to Sombra, who accepted them with a quiet solemnity. Miles away, Cien moved with the economy of a lizard. His two men struggled behind him, cursing the heat and the terrain, but Cien seemed unaffected. He wasn't looking for a continuous trail, but for anomalies, and he found one, a single horsehair, dark and coarse, caught on the thorn of an ocotillo. He rolled it between his thumb and forefinger. It was dry, but it still had life. He looked at the canyon walls ahead, reading the lines of shadow and the potential escape routes. The boy and the horse would need shade soon, and there was only one path through this maze that offered significant shelter from the midday sun. He was not following their trail, he was following the logic of survival, a logic he knew better than anyone. The boy's gamble to enter the broken land had been clever, but Cien knew a fundamental truth. A man alone can find a crack to hide in, but a horse always leaves a shadow, and he was hunting the shadow. The moisture from the cactus was a ghost of relief, a promise that barely lasted under the midday furnace. No sooner had they finished than Sombra moved, leading Itzàl away from the exposed spot. They entered a narrow fissure, a scar on the face of a cliff that Itzàl would never have noticed. The passage was so tight that he had to dismount, his shoulder scraping one wall as the horse's flank scraped the other. Temperature dropped several degrees at once. The crack opened into a hidden courtyard, an amphitheater of rock shaded by the cliff that rose above it like a giant's hand. It was a sanctuary, invisible from all directions except for that secret entrance. There, In the deep shade and silence, Itzàl finally allowed his body to tremble with exhaustion and delayed fear. He rested his forehead against Sombra's warm, dusty neck, and the horse stood perfectly still, a pillar of strength, lending its calm to the broken man who now depended on it for every breath. 2 hours later, Cien reached the cluster of rocks. His men, panting and cursing, collapsed in what little shade they could find. Cien, however, approached the barrel cactus as one would a crime scene. He saw the clean cut on top, the disturbed pulp, and the prints, both boot and hoof, in the loose sand. A thin, humorless smile curved his lips. He could almost hear old man Romero's voice whispering on the wind, teaching his tricks from beyond the grave. He scanned the ground, ignoring the obvious tracks and looking for the direction of their departure. He found it in a single scratch on the surface of a stone, where the iron of a horseshoe had left a pale mark while navigating a tight passage. He pointed with his chin. "That way," he said, his voice a low grunt. They didn't stop. They found shelter. The fox taught his cub well how to find burrows. The hunt had become an intimate duel, and Cien felt every move as if he were reading the mind of a long-dead rival. This hunt that has become an intimate duel between legacies is soul-chilling. If the intelligence and will demonstrated here have also captivated you, show your support with a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next move in this deadly game.